In the summer of 1889, a woman named Adeline Crew stood at the back of a county auction with $5 folded into her glove and a small wooden pony in her coat pocket. And she bought the one thing on the whole list that nobody else in the room would touch. She was 29 years old. 3 weeks before, she had been a wife with a roof over her head and a name that meant something at church. Then her husband died of a fever that took him in 4 days, and before the ground over him had even settled, his mother and his brother had gone through the house room by room, deciding what was the family's and what was the widow's. What belonged to the widow, it turned out, was almost nothing. A change of clothes, a comb, $5 pressed into her hand at the door like a fare for a coach she was expected to catch and never come back from. And the little carved pony, no longer than her thumb, that she had carried since she was a girl and that no one else had wanted. The lot she bought that day was the one the county could not sell. It sat at the very foot of the printed list under the heading of abandoned property, and the auctioneer read it out in a flat voice as though he were embarrassed by it. One steam riding gallery, he read, 40 carved horses. One pavilion standing, located in the abandoned town of Amaranth, at the floor of the canyon of the same name. And then he said the thing that made the whole room laugh. I am obliged to note, he added, dry as chalk, that no road runs into Amaranth wide enough to have carried it in, and none runs out wide enough to carry it away. Whoever buys it buys the mountain to go with it. The county had a name for the lot. They called it the Wooden Zoo. Do I hear a bid? The auctioneer said, and the room went quiet in that particular fashion. A room goes quiet when everyone has already decided the answer is no. So Adeline Crew raised her gloved hand with the $5 in it. $5, she said, in a voice that surprised her by not shaking. I will take the Wooden Zoo. A man near the front laughed and told his neighbor the widow had bought herself a mountain, and Adeline heard him, and she did not care. The clerk who took her dollar and wrote out the deed could not quite let her go without a word. You understand there's no road, ma'am, he said, sliding the paper across to her as if it might bite. No town, no living thing down there but rattlesnakes and rumor. Folks have been trying to give that lot away for 30 years. Adeline folded the deed into her glove beside the $4 she had left. Then, it's a wonder nobody wanted it, she said. The clerk studied her a moment, and something in his face softened from amusement into a kind of worry. There's a story about that carousel, he said, lower now. The writers say it turns by itself come June. My grandfather swore to it on his deathbed. Adeline asked him what he believed. I believe an old man saw what he wanted to see, the clerk said. But I'll tell you this for nothing. Whoever built a machine like that down there had a reason, and reasons like that don't die with the town. He did not know how right he was, and neither did she, but the words went down into her and stayed. Now, before we go down into that canyon with her, take a moment, if you would, to subscribe and tell us where in the world you are listening from tonight. Because what waited for Adeline down in Amaranth is the kind of thing that ought to be shared with someone. And here is what waited for her, named plainly now and kept honest until the end. A full carousel, 40 horses on brass poles beneath a peaked ground of cedar shingles, stood assembled and gleaming on the open floor of a canyon that no wagon could reach. Before this story is over, you will know how a machine that heavy climbed a roadless canyon in pieces on the backs of mules through one hard winter. And you will know why, for 34 years, the drovers and the mail riders who passed the mouth of that canyon have sworn on everything they hold sacred that on a few nights each early summer, the horses of Amaranth turn by themselves, slow and steady in the dark, with no living hand anywhere near them. The pony in her pocket had a white blaze painted down its carved nose. She had turned that little animal over in her fingers 10,000 times across 20 years, and she knew every notch of it, and yet the shape of that blaze had never matched a single thing she could remember. Not a horse she had ridden, not a picture she had seen. It was a mark from nowhere, and she had long ago stopped asking about it. Keep that white blaze in mind. She will not think of it again for a while. But it was carved by a hand that meant it, and a mark like that is a promise waiting a long time to be kept. She left the auction on foot and spent the first of her $5 on a ride as far as the freight road went, which was to a water stop called Dry Fork, where the stage let her down in a cloud of red grit. The woman who ran the water stop watched her ask the road to Amaranth and shook her head. "Nobody goes down there, honey," she said, setting a tin cup of water on the counter without being asked. "There's nothing in that canyon but rock and the wooden zoo, and the zoo's haunted, if you believe the riders. They swear the horses turn on their own of a June night. My own husband seen it, or says he did." Adeline asked her what she made of that, and the woman laughed not unkindly. "I make of it that men see what they drink," she said. "But I'll tell you honest, I wouldn't sleep down there for money." Adeline thanked her and drank the water and paid for a second cup to carry and set off anyway. From there she walked. The country she walked into was red rock country, the kind of land that looks like the bones of the earth left out in the sun. Orange and rust and the deep bruised purple of shadow where the walls leaned in. She had grown up in a country like this before she was sent east as a girl, and something in her chest loosened at the smell of hot stone and juniper, even as her feet blistered inside her town shoes. She had been told the canyon was a full day out. It took her 2. She slept the first night under an overhang with the pony held in her fist, and she was not afraid, which she found strange because she had been afraid every night for 3 weeks, and now, walking toward a thing everyone had laughed at, the fear had quietly let go of her. She came to the mouth of Amaranth in the last gold of the second afternoon. The canyon opened in front of her like a book opening, the 2 walls tall and close and streaked with old water stains, the floor below flat and sandy and scattered with the gray timber of a town that had died young. There was not much left of Amaranth. Silver had been found there, and a town had been thrown up in a single frantic season, and then the vein had pinched out to nothing almost as fast as it had appeared, and the people had gone and taken their doors and their window glass and their good lumber with them. What remained were the frames of things. A church with no roof, a row of foundations, a well with its rope rotted to fuzz. It was the loneliest place she had ever seen, and she stood at the top of the wagon track and looked down into it and thought, for one honest moment, that she had made a terrible mistake. And then she saw it, and every other thought went out of her head. It stood alone on the canyon floor near the far wall, where the last light was still touching the top of the rock. A great round pavilion, easily 30 feet across, its peaked roof of weathered cedar shingles catching the sun. And beneath that roof, frozen mid-gallop on their poles of tarnished brass, 40 carved horses. Even from the rim she could see the arch of their necks and the flare of their carved manes and the ghosts of paint still clinging to their flanks. Faded rose and cream and a blue gone almost to gray. They stood in their circle in the middle of a dead town, deep in a roadless canyon no wheel had ever reached. Patient and impossible, and the sight of them stopped the breath in her throat. It was true, then, everything the auctioneer had read out in his embarrassed voice was true. The wooden zoo was real, and it was hers, and she had $5 less for and a walk of 2 days between her and any living soul. She went down the track slowly, one careful step at a time, because her legs had started shaking and she could not entirely trust them. The nearer she came, the larger the thing grew, until she was standing at the edge of its wooden platform looking up at horses that were bigger than she was, their glass eyes catching the dying light and giving it back amber and warm. Somebody had loved these animals. That was the first thought that came to her clearly. Whatever else was true, whatever madness had carried a riding gallery to the bottom of the earth, the hands that had shaped these horses had loved them. She could see it in the muscle carved into a haunch, in the separate curl of each strand of a mane, in the small kind detail of a carved bridle buckle no rider would ever notice. She reached up and laid her bare hand against the nearest flank, and the wood was warm from the day, warm as a living thing, and she stood there with her palm flat against a wooden horse in a dead canyon, and did something she had not let herself do at the funeral, or at the auction, or on either night of the walk. She wept, not for her husband exactly, and not for the house she had lost, and not even for the $5 that were nearly $4 now. She wept because for 3 weeks the world had told her in 100 small ways that she was worth about as much as this canyon and these forgotten horses, which was to say nothing at all. A scorned line at the foot of a list that made a room full of men laugh. And here she was, standing among the things the world had thrown away, and they were beautiful. She had bought a mountain and 40 wooden horses and a dead town, and she was the only person on earth who had wanted them, and somehow, impossibly, that felt less like a joke than anything had felt in a long time. She could not have known yet that her own father had carved the horse she was touching. She had no notion that his workbench still stood in a shed 20 steps behind her, or that his name was the name the whole county had spent 34 years turning into a joke of its own. She only knew that the light was going, and that she was very tired, and that she was. For the first time since her husband's fever broke, exactly where she wanted to be. She made her small camp against the wooden platform in the shelter of the horses, and she fell asleep with the carved pony in her hand and its white blaze pressed against her palm. And above the canyon the first stars came out hard and clean, and the horses stood their silent circle over her, and nothing turned. Because it was only the middle of May, and the thing that turned them was still a month away. Morning is an honest hour, and morning told her the truth the sunset had been kind enough to hide. She woke stiff and cold in the blue light before dawn, and the first thing she saw when she opened her eyes was the underside of the peaked roof, and it was not the wonder it had seemed to be. The canvas crown that had once ringed the roof of the pavilion, the painted skirt that a showman would have hung with flags and mirrors to catch a crowd, was gone almost entirely, hanging in gray rags from a few rusted tacks and stirring along the crown's rim in the dawn wind like the last leaves on a dead tree. She sat up and looked, in the plain gray light, at what she had bought. And a slow, cold disappointment came up in her chest like water filling a boot. The horses were beautiful, yes, but they were also old and hurt and left. Paint had blistered and curled off their flanks and scales. One had lost a carved ear to some long-ago knock. The brass poles were green with tarnish where the sun never reached them and pitted where it did. She walked the circle slowly, her town shoes loud on the plank floor, and every step showed her something else that 34 years had taken. A carved swan on the side of one of the two chariots had been chewed to a stub of pale splinters, and when she leaned close, she saw the reason: a nest of shredded canvas and juniper bark tucked up under the seat, home now to a family of pack rats who had made better use of the wooden zoo than any person had. The center of the pavilion, where the great pole rose to the crown, was a tangle of iron gearing furred thick with dust and old grease gone to tar. And where the steam engine should have stood, the boiler that had once driven the whole grand machine, there was nothing but a stained ring on the planks and 4 rusted bolt holes. The boiler was gone, hauled out for scrap, most likely in the first year after the town died, when iron was worth carrying and wood was not. She sat down on the edge of the platform with her back against a wooden horse's foreleg, and she made herself think like a widow with $4 instead of like a woman who had wept over painted horses in the dark. There was no engine. There was no road. There was no crowd for 50 miles and no town for the crowd to come from. The dream she had let herself have on the walk-in, some soft, foolish dream of children laughing and a machine turning in a place that was hers, was exactly that, a dream, and the daylight had burned it off like dew. What she had was carved wood, and carved wood had value, even out here. A man had laughed at the auction, but a man in the city would not laugh at 40 hand-carved horses. She could sell them, one at a time if she had to, ear less ones cheap and whole ones dear, and the money might carry her a year, might carry her to a city and a boarding house, and some quiet clerk's work might carry her far enough from her husband's family that she never had to see their faces measuring her again. That was the sensible plan. She decided on it sitting there in the cold, and she was almost relieved to have a plan, and she meant to start that very morning by taking a full accounting of what she owned. So she went looking for a tool, something to pry and lever with, and that search is what undid her sensible plan, because the search took her behind the pavilion to a low shed she had not seen in the dark. And the shed was where the questions began. It was a workman's shed, built of the same cedar as the crown, and it had held up far better than anything else in Amaranth. Its roof sound, its door still on its leather hinges. Inside, in the gloom, was a carpenter's bench, long and heavy and scarred with the marks of decades of good work, and above it a rack of tools hung each in its place. Chisels and gouges and rasps and a draw knife, their handles worn pale and smooth. Wood shavings still lay curled on the floor, dry as paper. And here was the first thing that did not fit. The first small wrongness that would grow and grow until it swallowed her whole sensible plan. The tools were not rusted. Out here, in this dry canyon, 34 years should have left even good steel freckled orange. But the edges of those chisels held a dull gray gleam, and when she took one down and touched her thumb carefully to the bevel, it was sharp, honestly sharp. Sharp as a tool that had been stoned and oiled and put away by someone who cared, and not so very long ago. She stood in the doorway of that shed with the chisel in her grip and felt the hair rise on her arms. Somebody had been here. Not in a boom time 30 for years gone. Recently, within a few years, at most, judging by the shavings and the sharpness and the oil that still darkened the rag folded on the corner of the bench. But that made no sense, because there was no road and no town and no reason on earth for a man to walk 2 days into a dead canyon to sharpen chisels nobody would use. She went back out to the carousel, and now she looked at it with different eyes. The eyes of someone who has just learned that a thing she thought was abandoned is being tended, and once she was looking, she could not stop seeing it. The crown of cedar shingles above her that she had taken for original was not original at all. Half of it was old, silvered wood curled at the edges, but the other half, the half over the shed side, was newer, the cedar still faintly red-brown in the shadow of the overlap, laid in careful courses by a patient hand, nailed with square-cut nails, replacing shingles that must have blown off in some storm long after the last citizen of Amaranth had gone. Somebody had re-roofed a carousel in a ghost town. Somebody had climbed up there with a bundle of shingles on his shoulder and spent days keeping the rain off 40 horses that no living person came to ride. But it was the gearing at the center that finally sat her down on the platform a second time. This time, not from disappointment, but from something closer to fear. She had seen at dawn that the iron was furred with old grease gone to tar. And so it was, most of it, the outer cases and the housings black and stiff. But down among the works, where the great crankshaft rode in its bearings at the foot of the center pole, the metal was bright. Not scrubbed clean, not polished for show. Bright as a thing is bright only when it is used and oiled. A film of fresh grease lying over it, keeping the air and the rust away. She crouched and peered up into the works, and she saw them then, fixed to the shaft above each bearing. Small brass cups with glass sides and little screw caps, and inside the glass she could see it, a slow amber bead of oil hanging at the bottom of a wick, feeding down drop by patient drop onto the bearing below. Self-feeding oil cups. Sealed drip feeders, the kind a careful machinist fits to a shaft so that a machine will keep itself in grease long after his own hand is gone from the crank. And these cups were not empty and not dry and not 34 years abandoned. These cups still had oil in them. Adeline Crew knelt in the dust under a carousel in a dead canyon, with a sharp chisel in one hand and her father's whole silence about to open under her like a floor. And she said aloud, to the horses and the rock and the empty town, the only sensible question left to her. "Who has been keeping you?" she asked them. "Who comes all this way, and why, and for whom?" She turned the sharp chisel over in her fingers and answered her own question the only sane way she could. "Nobody keeps a dead machine for nothing," she said. "Somebody wanted you kept. Somebody with a reason worth 2 days of walking and a lifetime of climbing that roof." She thought of the tools stoned and oiled, the shingles laid in careful courses, the bright bearings under their beads of oil, and a strange certainty came up in her that she said out loud before she could think better of it. "You are not abandoned at all," she told the horses. "You are being loved by somebody who is gone, and I am going to find out who." She did not sell a single horse that day. She could not have said exactly why, except that a person does not sell a house while she suspects someone is still living in it. And the carousel had begun to feel less like a heap of salvage and more like a house with someone still living in it. So she stayed. She built her fire in the ring where the boiler had been. She drank from her canteen and rationed the little food she had and told herself she would leave in a day or two once she understood, though she had not yet admitted to herself that this was a lie, that she would never leave that canyon again. The grease book she found on the second day, and finding it, is where the ghost story began, very quietly, to come apart. It was in the shed, in a shallow drawer beneath the bench, that she had missed the first time because it had no handle, only a finger notch cut into the wood. Inside lay a book, not a Bible, not a ledger of accounts, but a workman's book, bound in canvas and swollen with damp long since dried, its pages ruled by hand and filled edge to edge with a small, square engineer's printing. A grease book, a machinist would have called it, the running record a careful man keeps of a machine he tends. She turned the pages by firelight and could make little of the columns at first, the dates and the terse notes beside them, and she read a few of them aloud into the dark just to hear a human voice, even a dead man's borrowed one. Number 2, bearing re-poured, she read. Crown reshingled, east quarter, cedar, race cleared of sand after the March blow. Governor Waits eased, wick renewed, all cups. On and on it ran, year after year, a man's patient conversation with a machine, back and back through the dates until she reached the first page, and on that first page, in the same square hand, was written a name, and the name was Elias Crew. The book fell out of her hands. Crew, her name. Her maiden name, the name she had been born to before she was Adeline the widow, before she was Adeline the wife, back when she was Adeline Crew, a girl of 8 in a canyon country very like this one, with a father who smelled of cedar shavings and machine oil and who could make a block of pine become a running horse under his knife. Elias Crew. Her father, the father she had been told when she was sent east to her aunt after her mother died, had gone to ruin in the silver camps and was better forgotten. The father whose letters had stopped coming when she was 12, and whom she had, God forgive her, mostly managed to forget, because it is easier to forget a man than to keep grieving one who never comes. Her father had carved these horses. Her father had raised this shed and this bench. Her father had knelt where she was kneeling and fitted the little brass oil cups with his own hands, and her father, by the dates in this book, had gone on tending this machine in this dead town for years and years after every other living soul had walked out of Amaranth and left it to the rats and the sun. She sat with the book in her lap and wept for the second time, and this weeping was different from the first, because the first had been for herself and this was for him, for a man she had thrown away as surely as the county had, a man she had let become a joke and a shame in her own mind, because that was the story she had been handed, and she had been too tired and too young to question it. And here I will ask you to stay with me, because the next thing Adeline learned turned everything the county believed about her father exactly upside down. And if this story has found you and you would like to hear how it ends, this is the moment to subscribe, so that a man who was mocked for 34 years can finally be understood by a few more people before we are through. For the county did have a story about Elias Crew, and Adeline heard it later in full, but she began to guess at it there in the shed. The showman who had dreamed up the boom time celebration at Amaranth, who had ordered a grand steam riding gallery hauled to the floor of a canyon to dazzle a silver town that lasted one season, had hired a carver machinist to finish and assemble the machine. And that carver was Elias Crew. When the vein pinched out and the showman fled his debts, the county had been left holding an impossible, unsellable folly on the canyon floor, and it needed someone to blame, and the man still standing next to the thing was the carver. So the county decided, in the comfortable way that a county decides such things, that Elias Crew was a fool who had helped a swindler carry a carousel to nowhere, and it laughed at him, and it forgot him, and it went on laughing at the wooden zoo for 34 years without once wondering why the fool had never left. Adeline was beginning to wonder exactly that. Why had he stayed? A carver could work anywhere. A man with hands like his could have gone to any city in the country and made a fine living making anything he pleased. But he had stayed, alone, in a canyon with no road and no people, tending a machine that could not run, keeping its bearings bright and its roof sound year upon year upon year. And no man does a thing like that without a reason, and the reason was not in the columns of dates. The reason, she felt certain, was somewhere in the machine itself, in the parts of it she did not yet understand. So she went to understand it. She took the grease book and she read it as a map, and she went out from the shed to find the things it named. And this is the part of the story where the canyon began to give up its secret one rung at a time, each answer opening a larger question, each larger question drawing her further in. The book spoke of a tail race cleared of sand after the March blow, and she did not know what a tail race was, but she knew that a race to a millwright is a channel that carries water. And so she went looking for a channel, and she found one. Chiseled into the living rock of the canyon floor, running from behind the center of the pavilion out toward a crack in the base of the far wall, was a groove, straight and square-cut and unmistakably made by a human hand with an iron tool and a great deal of time. It was half filled with wind-blown sand, but she cleared a length of it with her hands and saw the tool marks in the bottom, the patient overlapping bites of a chisel, hundreds of thousands of them. A man had carved a canal in solid stone for water, but there was no water. The canyon floor was bone dry, dry as it had been for months, dry as it would stay until, though she did not know it yet, the season turned. The race led her behind the pavilion, to the foot of the center pole where it passed down through the plank floor into the rock beneath, and there, set into a notch cut in the sandstone and half hidden behind a fall of dry brush that she had to pull away by the armful, she found the thing that made her sit down hard on the stone with her heart going like a hammer. A wheel. Not a wagon wheel and not a mill wheel of the wide, slow kind, but a small, heavy, cunning wheel of iron, its rim ringed all the way around with curved iron cups like a double row of cupped hands, mounted on a shaft that ran through the rock and, she could see now, coupled by a long leather belt, cracked but whole, up through a slot in the floor to the gearing overhead. She knew, without knowing the name, that she was looking at a water motor, a wheel built to be struck by a hard jet of water and spun fast and made to turn machinery. It was, though the word meant nothing to her then, a Pelton wheel, the small canyon country water motor of that decade, the kind of wheel that ran the stamp mills and the shop lathes of men who had a spring above them and a machine below. Her father had set one behind the carousel, cut a channel in the rock to carry water to it, and belted it to the horses. But a wheel like that needs water thrown at it under force, and force means fall, and fall means the water must come from above. So she looked up, following the line the race would take backward, up the sloping apron of rock at the base of the canyon wall, and high up there, tucked in a fold of the sandstone where a seep had stained the rock dark, she saw the last piece, the header. A shallow basin dammed with mortared stone, a little rock cistern built to hold water and let it down through a pipe to the wheel below. It was empty now, dry and cracked and empty, a stone bowl full of nothing but sand and a dead juniper. But she understood, standing there in the heat with the grease book in her hand, what it was for. When that basin filled, and only when it filled, water would fall to the wheel, and the wheel would spin, and the belt would turn, and the horses would ride. Her father had given the Carousel a heart that needed no fire and no coal and no man at the crank. He had given it water for blood. The only question left, the question that held the whole 34-year ghost story inside it, was simple and terrible, and she asked it aloud to the empty basin as she had asked the horses. "When do you feel?" she said to the dry stone. "When does the water come?" The grease book answered her once she knew to read it for the answer. She went back through the columns by firelight, and now she saw what she had passed over before, because a man writes down the day he does his work, and the days told their own story. Wick renewed, all cups, and a date in late May. Tail race cleared of sand, and a date in early June. Belt dressed and slacked, a date in June. Year after year, the heaviest work, the tending that a machine needs just before it is asked to run, fell always in the same short stretch of the calendar, the last week of May and the first weeks of June. And she understood. The spring above the header basin was a snowmelt spring. It ran dry 10 or 11 months of the year, the canyon floor cracked and thirsty, the wheel still. But when the high country, far above the rim, let go of its winter, when the June sun reached the last of the snow in the heights and sent it down through the rock to the seep above the canyon, the basin filled, and the water fell. And for a few nights each early summer, and only then, the Carousel of Amaranth came alive. Not by any ghost. By the plain, honest arithmetic of snow and stone and a wheel, set turning by a man who had known the mountains would keep his appointment long after he could not. The drovers and the mail riders had not been lying. That was what struck her most, sitting there with the book. For 34 years they had sworn that the horses turned on their own on a few June nights, and they had been telling the exact truth, and the county had laughed at them as it had laughed at her father. Because the truth sounded like a ghost story, and nobody had walked 2 days into a dead canyon in the right week of the right month to see that it was instead a piece of engineering, patient and sane and beautiful. The ghost of Amaranth was a water wheel, and the man who had made the ghost was her father, and he had made it. She was beginning to feel with a certainty that frightened her, for a reason she had not yet let herself say. It was the middle of May when she understood all this, which meant, if the book was right, that she had only to wait. So she waited. She was down to her last coins and her last flour. And she should by every sensible measure have walked back out to Dry Fork and sold a horse and saved herself, and instead she stayed in the dead town and waited for the snow far above her to melt, because she could no more have left before that basin filled than a woman can leave a bedside before the fever breaks. She rationed. She snared a rabbit, and was ashamed of how glad she was of it. She swept the pavilion floor and oiled the tools and read her father's book until she knew his hand as well as her own, and each morning she climbed the apron of rock to lay her palm against the dry stone of the header basin and feel whether the season had turned, and for 3 weeks it was dry. And then, on a morning near the very start of June, she climbed up and laid her hand in the basin, and the sand at the bottom was dark and cool and damp. The spring had begun to run. It filled slowly over 4 days, a thread of water sliding down the stained rock and pooling in the stone bowl her father had built to catch it, rising a finger's width a day while she watched and could hardly eat for watching. On the 4th evening, the water reached the lip of the pipe. She heard it before she saw what it meant, a trickle, then a gurgle, then a sudden bright hiss as the head of water drove down the pipe and struck the wheel below, and she scrambled down the rock with her heart in her mouth and came around the back of the pavilion in the last purple light and saw the little iron wheel turning. Throwing a fan of silver water faster and faster, the cracked old belt drawing taut and beginning, with a groan of waking iron, to move. Inside the pavilion, the gearing turned. The great crankshaft that her father had kept bright for 34 years took up the belt's pull, and the housings that had furred to tar cracked and complained and then, one by one, gave in. And the center pole began to rotate, and the horses, all 40 of them, began, for the first time in her life and the first time in 34 years of moonlit rumor, to move. Adeline stood in the middle of the dead town of Amaranth as the light failed and the moon came up over the rim, and she watched the horses of the wooden zoo rise and fall on their brass poles and go around, slow and stately and sure, their glass eyes catching the moon and passing it hand to hand around the circle, and this time no tears came. She was past weeping. She stood with the carved pony gripped tight, her mouth open, and something enormous and wordless filling up the whole of her chest, and then she did the only thing there was to do, the thing her father must have wanted some living soul to do all along. She stepped up onto the moving platform, and she found the lead horse at the head of the circle, the tallest and finest of them. And she climbed up into its cracked saddle, and she rode. She rode alone, in the dark, in a canyon 1,000 miles from anywhere, on a carousel driven by melted snow, under a moon that lit the red rock to the color of banked coals, and the machine carried her around and around, rising and falling beneath her, the gears singing their low-ironed song, and Adeline Crew laughed out loud. A sound she had not made in years, a sound that went up the canyon walls and came back to her doubled, as though the town were laughing with her at last instead of at her father. "You were not a fool," she said aloud to the moon and the moving horses and the dead man who had made them. "You were never a fool. Look at what you did. Just look at what you did." The ghost story was engineering, and the engineering, she understood as she rode, was love, for whom she could not yet say. She had not climbed down to look, in the moonlight, at the horse beneath her, and she had not found her own name, and those things were still an hour ahead of her. But she knew, going around under the stars, that the man the county had called a fool had built the sanest, most patient machine ever shaped by a human hand, and had aimed it across 3 decades at this one night and no other, and she meant before she was done to learn exactly why. She might have had her answer that same week, gently, in her own time, if the world had let her alone. The world did not let her alone. The world, in the shape of a man named Orange Sledge, came down the wagon track 4 mornings later, while the spring was still running and the horses still turned each night, and it came, as trouble so often does, with its papers in perfect order. She heard the mules first, a string of them, and then she saw the men, 3 of them, picking their way down the track that she had come down alone, and at their head on a good bay horse rode a heavy, prosperous, unhurried man in a linen duster and a hard hat, who reined up at the edge of the dead town and looked at the turning carousel with the flat, pricing eye of a man looking at meat. He did not seem surprised to find a woman living among the horses. He seemed, if anything, mildly inconvenienced by it. Orange Sledge was a broker. He bought and sold amusements, he told her. Once he had climbed down and looked her over and decided she was nobody to trouble about. He supplied the great new pleasure parks going up back east, the ones by the seashore where a carved carousel horse in good paint fetched a fine price from a crowd that had never seen one carved by hand and never would again. He had heard the wooden zoo story in 100 bar rooms over the years, as everyone in the territory had, and unlike everyone in the territory, he had troubled to find out who held the title, and when he learned the county had let the lot go at auction, he had troubled further, and he had come, he said, to collect what he had lawfully bought. He held out a paper. It was a chattel writ, drawn up proper and stamped. An order of sale for the movable property known as the Amaranth Riding Gallery, 40 carved figures, purchased by one orange sledge from a party representing the original showman's outstanding creditors. "It is entirely legal, madam," he said, "and it is not gentle. My men will have every horse off its pole by week's end. We saw them at the shoulder and the hock, crate them, and walk them out on the mules. You are welcome to keep the frame, and the roof, and the rats. They are worth precisely what you paid for them." He said it with a thin smile, a man used to widows and used to winning. Adeline stood between the broker and the horses and felt the old cold measuring come over her. The feeling of a room full of people deciding she was worth nothing, and this time she found she did not accept it. She did not shout. She had learned something in that canyon about patience from a man who had chiseled a canal in solid rock, one bite at a time. "May I read it again?" she said, and it was not truly a question, and she took her time over the paper while Sledge waited, and as she read she felt the shape of an answer rising in her, because she had spent 3 weeks reading another set of papers by firelight, and she knew something about this machine that Orange Sledge, for all his troubling to find out, did not. His writ ran from the showman's creditors. It rested on the claim that the Carousel had belonged to the showman, and that the showman's debts had passed his property to those he owed, and that Sledge had bought their claim. Every link of that chain hung on the first link. The Carousel had to have been the showman's to owe against. And Adeline had read, in the front pages of her father's grease book, and then, on the strength of what the book told her, in the county's own recorded books when she later walked back out to check, the one document that cut that first link clean through. Before the showman fled his debts in the last frantic weeks of the dying boom, he had not had the cash to pay the carver who had finished and assembled his grand machine. So he had done what a fleeing man does. He had paid in kind. He had signed the riding gallery itself over to Elias Crew in full settlement of the carving debt, and the transfer had been taken down and recorded at the county seat by a clerk who then promptly forgot it, as the whole county forgot everything about Amaranth. The showman had signed the horses away before he ran. They had never been his to owe against. They had been her father's, lawfully and on the record for 34 years, and at the auction they had become hers. She told him plainly, without heat, and she watched his prosperous face work as he understood what it meant. She did not gloat. There was no pleasure in it worth having. "Your paper begins with the showman," she said. "It rests on the machine having been his, so that his debts could carry it to the men he owed, so that you could buy their claim. But the machine was never his to owe against. In the last weeks of the boom, he had no cash to pay the carver who finished it, so he paid in kind. He signed the whole riding gallery over to my father in settlement, and a clerk at the county seat wrote it in the book before the showman ran. The record is 34 years old. Your writ is a season old. Send your lawyer the 2 days in and the 2 days out if you like, and he will tell you the same. The horses stay on their poles." Sledge looked at her a long moment, and then at the horses, and then, being a businessman and not a fool, he did the arithmetic that businessmen do. The cost of a lawyer against the value of the goods against the certainty of the loss, and he arrived at the same sum any businessman would. He touched his hat to her without warmth, but without malice. And he said the one thing she remembered afterward. "Your father," said Orrin Sledge, "must have been a very stubborn man." "He was," said Adeline. "I am only now learning how much." And the broker gathered his men and his mules and his useless paper and climbed back up the track he had come down. And the ghost town kept its horses. And Adeline Crewe sat on the turning platform with her father's book in her lap and understood that she had just defended against a man with every advantage, a thing she had bought for the last dollar of a dead man's severance. She had not won it with force. She had won it with understanding, with the plain recorded truth of what her father had quietly done. And that felt exactly right. Because everything in this canyon had been won so, by understanding one patient rung at a time. There was one rung left, and it was the one her father had built the whole machine to bring her to, and she came to it that night. She had read the grease book front to back a dozen times, the columns and the terse notes, but she had never read the last pages, because the last pages were not columns. The last pages were close-written prose, a man's hand grown older and shakier down the years, and something in her had held them back, had saved them, the same as a child saves the last of a sweet. That night, with the horses turning and the moon high and Orrin Sledge 2 days gone, she sat against the lead horse's foreleg, and she read the last pages of her father's book by the light of her small fire. And her father, 34 years dead to her, and only now come alive, finally told her why. He had not been a fool, and he had not been a swindler's dupe. And he had known exactly what he was doing when he stayed. He wrote it plainly, and his own words are the truest telling of it. When the vein died and the showman ran, he had written, "He left me the machine in place of my wages, and I found I owned a thing I could not sell and could not move and could not bring myself to break for the wood and the brass. Because I carved every horse of it with these hands, and a man does not chop up his own children for kindling." He had a daughter, he wrote, sent East years before to her aunt when her mother died, a girl he had meant to send for the moment he had money enough to make a home she would not be ashamed of. She wrote me less each year, ran his hand across the swollen page, for they taught her, kindly and completely, that her father was a failure and a fool, and I came to see that I had lost her, that the money to bring her home was never coming, and that before I could make her a home she would be grown and gone and would not want a stranger's canyon. So he had done, he wrote, the only thing left to a man in his position, which was to make her something instead of sending for her. "I cannot give her a home," his letter went on, "so I will give her a wonder." He was a machinist and a carver, and he had a canyon and a spring and 40 horses, and he had time, all the time in the world, and nothing to spend it on. And so across the empty years he had given the Carousel a heart that would beat without him. He had cut the channel in the rock one chisel bite at a time. He had set the little water wheel in its notch, dammed the header basin, dressed the belt, and fitted the sealed oil cups that would feed the bearings long after his own hands were still. He had tuned the whole machine to the one thing in that country a man could trust to keep an appointment, the June snowmelt, so that every early summer, whether he lived to see it or not, the spring would rise and the water would fall and the horses would ride, and then, in the shaky hand of his last years, He had set down the reason, the sentence Adeline read 3 times over with the firelight swimming and her throat closed tight. I tuned her to run herself each June, long after I am gone, he had written, so that somewhere in this world the horses would still be turning for her, in case she ever comes looking, and if she does, she will find not an empty grave and a stranger's shame, but a thing her father made and kept alive for her with every year he had left. There was a passage further down the page that she would carry with her all her remaining years, the nearest thing to a voice from him she would ever have. If you are reading this, then you came, he had written, and if you came, then the horses are turning. For I have set them to turn in the 1 week I could be sure of, and I have kept every part of this old animal in oil and grease against the day. Do not grieve the years, daughter, I did not. A man who has a thing to build for someone he loves is never truly alone. And I had 34 winters of building, which is more than most men get. Only do one thing I could never do down here by myself. Do not keep it a secret. Let them come. Let the little ones ride. A wonder is a poor thing kept, and a whole thing given away. She read it, and she pressed the page flat with her hand, and she promised the dark that she would. He had not known if she would ever come. He had done it anyway. That was the part that broke her and the part that mended her, both at once. He had spent 3 decades keeping a promise to a daughter who might never appear, aiming the whole machine at the bare chance, only the chance, that one day she would stand in this canyon and understand. And she had. She had bought the lot no one wanted with the last of a dead man's severance, and she had made the long walk in, and she had stayed and read and waited and understood, and she was here, and the horses were turning, and somewhere on the far side of death her father had been right to hope. There was more, and she went to find it, because the book told her where to look. Climb up, her father had written, and feel under the saddle of the lead horse. So she climbed onto the turning platform one more time, and she found the tallest and finest of them at the front of the circle, the one she had ridden that first night, and she felt with her fingers under the carved lip of its saddle, in the shadow where no rider would ever look. And there, cut into the wood in his small square knife strokes, she found 2 words. She found her name. Adeline, she read aloud, and then the second word, her own maiden name, the name she had been born to. Adeline Crew. It was set into the heart of the machine by the hand of the man who made it, put there 3 decades before she arrived. Waiting in the dark under a saddle for a daughter to come and run her fingers across it. You knew, she whispered to the turning horses. All this time you knew I would come, and you left me my name to find. You never gave up on me, not once, not in 34 years. And I very nearly gave up on you. Forgive me for that. I am here now. I am not going anywhere. And then she understood the pony. She took the little carved pony from her pocket, the one she had carried since she was 8 years old, the one with the white blaze painted down its nose that had never matched a single horse she had ever seen. And she held it up beside the lead horse in the moonlight, and there it was, plain as morning. The white blaze on the great carved lead horse ran down its nose in the exact shape of the blaze on her little pony. They were the same horse. Her father had carved her a pony when she was small, before she was ever sent away, and he had given the pony a blaze from his own imagining, a mark from nowhere. And then across all the years alone, he had carved that same blaze onto the lead horse of the whole machine, so that the toy in the child's pocket and the great horse at the head of the circle would carry the same mark. A father's signature written twice, once small enough to fit in her hand and once large enough to ride. The blaze had never matched anything she remembered because it had not come from anything she remembered. It had come from him. It had always, only come from him. She sat in the saddle of the lead horse with the pony in her fist and the two blazes together. And the machine carried her around under the June moon, and Adeline Crew, who 3 weeks before had been handed $5 at a door and told she was worth nothing, understood that she was and had always been the most wanted thing in the world to at least one man, who had spent his whole ruined life building her a way to find it out. She stayed. Of course she stayed. She wrote to no lawyer and demanded no fee from the county and took no revenge on the husband's family who had turned her out, because none of that was worth a single turn of the wheel, and she had learned in that canyon exactly what things were worth. She became the keeper of Amaranth, and it is a strange word for a strange office, but there is no better one. She patched the crown and dressed the belt and kept the oil cups full, taking up her father's book and adding her own hand to the columns beneath his, a daughter's conversation with a machine continuing a father's. And she did the one thing her father, alone all those years, had never been able to do. She let people in. For it turned out that a carousel is a poor secret and a wonderful gift, and word of a widow in the Lost Canyon whose horses truly turned each June went out through the valley as the ghost story once had. Only now it was true, and it was welcome. And each year, in the first week of that month, when the spring ran high and the wheel spun and the horses rose and fell, the families of the valley made the long, dusty walk down with their children, and the children rode. They rode the animals a lonely carver had shaped by hand, on the machine he had aimed across the years to run itself, in the season he had chosen, because the mountains could be trusted to keep it, and they laughed the same bright laugh Adeline had laughed that first night. Once a small girl clutching the pole of a rose-colored mare looked up at the keeper and asked her who made the horses go, and Adeline, standing at the heart of it all, with the light coming down the tall red walls, told her the truth. A man who loved somebody very much, she said, and never stopped, even after everyone told him to. The girl frowned up at her and asked whether the man was still there, somewhere watching. No, little one, Adeline told her gently. He went on a long time ago. But he left the horses running, and he left me here to keep them, and that is very nearly the same thing as staying. And for 1 week every summer the ghost town of Amaranth was not dead at all. If there is a person in your own life who was called a fool by people who never troubled to understand what he was quietly making, and if you have half believed them because believing them was easier than the grief, perhaps this is the night to wonder what he was building all that time, and for whom. And if this story has stayed with you, tell me before you go. Would you rather have been the father who kept a promise for 34 years to a daughter who might never come, or the daughter who came at last and understood, or is the truest thing simply that neither one is a fool, and that a promise kept in the dark is never wasted, even if it waits a lifetime to be found? There was one page Adeline never read aloud, not to the Valley families and not to the children and not to anyone, the very last page of her father's book, folded once and creased soft with her own handling, and what he wrote to her there she kept for herself. The last small secret of a canyon full of them, the one turn of the wheel that was hers alone. But the rest she gave away freely, every June for the rest of her long life. And long after she too was gone, the horses of Amaranth went on turning, 1 week a year, when the snow let go of the heights and the water fell and the wheel took up its old iron song, and the lead horse with the white blaze carried whoever climbed into its saddle around and around under the canyon moon, still keeping, patient as stone. The most stubborn and tender promise a father ever built into a machine, so that somewhere in the world the horses would still be turning for her.